Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. I didn't understand a word of it, but it was fantastic. So I caught a couple words in there, so it seemed roughly on point, so thank you. We're here this afternoon to talk about the purpose economy, and I was very lucky to spend the last 24 hours here. I can say very much the purpose economy is very much alive here. The people I've met, the conversations, the desire to really make the world a better place, to realize the potential of work. So to some degree, I feel like you should be teaching me based on what I've seen over the last 24 hours. But I'm going to share with you my journey and the research that has really led to the idea that we are in a new economic era where purpose is what defines value, what defines innovation in our overall marketplace, and share with you research specifically around how do you as leaders, because you're all leaders in this room, how do you go from this idea, this aspiration of purpose, of answering the question of why, to actually making that part of everyday work for the people who are in your organizations. So is everybody ready for the ride? All right. The journey for me begins with my last organization, which you did, I'm not sure what the sentence said, but you did mention it, the Taproot Foundation. It was a NGO, a nonprofit organization, that had a very simple idea behind it, which is that NGOs need marketing, technology, HR, finance, et cetera, just like companies do, and yet are often unable to afford those resources and are held back from making the impact that they want to make in the world. And what I realized was we had an opportunity to leverage business professionals, to leverage those very people in marketing and tech, et cetera, to do pro bono work, to volunteer their skills to help NGOs be more successful. And over the course of about a dozen years, we scaled from an experiment to an organization in 7 cities across the United States. But we realized that wasn't enough, and we started working with companies to build these programs in many of the leading brands in the United States. But that wasn't enough, so we started working with the president and the White House and built a national campaign that ultimately got to the point where we had a marketplace for $15 billion a year in pro bono services, not just volunteering, but services using people's professional skills to make a difference. The challenge was that it wasn't enough. And let me explain why. What we heard from these business professionals, and these were tens of thousands of business professionals in the US, and then ultimately around the world working with the BMW Foundation. We heard people say consistently, I find pro bono work so much more rewarding than a paycheck job. They found this volunteering work so much more rewarding. Does that surprise anybody in the audience? It's kind of to be expected, right? And at first we were like, this is a party we're celebrating. We've created Disneyland for work, right? Disneyland's the happiest place on earth. We had created sort of that same experience for work by creating this deeply meaningful experience. But then the reason I left to start Imperative, I left the Taproot Foundation, was for the same reason, which is with the exception of a few very creepy people, no one lives at Disneyland, right? And this is the same problem. Volunteering was being used to create a sense of meaning in work, and it wasn't addressing the core issue. The core issue was that work itself wasn't meaningful. And I started working with LinkedIn. How many of you are LinkedIn members? Most of you? Started working with LinkedIn on their social impact strategy and making it possible for people on LinkedIn to raise their hand virtually and say they wanted to do volunteer work, they wanted to use their professional skills for good. And in under a year, we had 1 million people raise their hands on the platform. 1 million people said, I want to do volunteering, I want to do pro bono work in the community. The problem was, well, there were 1 million people saying they wanted to do it. Only 1,000 nonprofits actually posted opportunities. The challenge is not only that we need to make work more fulfilling, but that fundamentally there isn't enough demand to satisfy that appetite for meaning just through volunteering. That we have a fundamental disconnect in the marketplace that had to be addressed. And the reason for this, and we found in a study we did with New York University, is that 66% of the US workforce is unfulfilled at work. 66%. And you think about what does that mean for an individual to be unfulfilled at work? What is the implication for organizations to have 2/3 of employees unfulfilled at work? And ultimately, what is the impact on our society? What is the impact on our health? What is the impact on our broader economy, education, et cetera? And we have so many people at work who are unfulfilled. I believe strongly that there's no metric that changing will make a greater impact on the world than figuring out how to make everyone fulfilled at work. How do we fundamentally change this so that the majority, at least, are fulfilled, not unfulfilled? The first thing I realized was that we have a lot of myths in our culture and our society about what purpose is. And this is actually preventing people from finding purpose because they were focused on these myths. These myths were defining what they thought would actually bring them a sense of meaning in their lives and in their work. So I want to share with you these 3 myths because these really are the foundation for starting on that journey towards purpose. The first is that purpose is about a cause, that it's about fundamentally making a difference in a specific issue, that we need to know what is the cause that we want to make an impact on, and that's what defines purpose. And this is a very common myth about purpose and meaning at work. The reality is we found people working in the nonprofit NGO sector that were deeply unfulfilled by work, and we found people in the basement of accounting firms that were deeply fulfilled by their work. The idea that a certain job or a cause is what's going to create a sense of meaning is not true. The majority of people in healthcare, education, government are not fulfilled by their work. We cannot continue to rely on this idea that it's the cause that brings us a sense of meaning. The second myth was that somehow you were going to climb a mountain, which I think here would be hard, but you could find one. Maybe go to Switzerland. Climb a mountain, you get struck by lightning, and you're given a tablet that tells you what your purpose is. We're sort of waiting around for someone to give us this revelation, this immediate understanding of, now I know why I'm on this planet. This is my purpose. And the problem with this is that it's us sitting around waiting for purpose to happen to us. And instead of taking responsibility for slowly over time on a journey, learning to understand what your purpose is. So again, this waiting for a revelation, a lot of people are waiting for purpose because they're waiting to be struck by lightning, instead of figuring out how to create meaning every day and to learn about what moves them on a daily basis. Then finally, we heard this myth consistently that purpose and meaning is only for people once you have a certain amount of money. Once you're Bill Gates, once you are a vice president, once you have your own boat, your Mercedes, now you're allowed to talk about purpose. But we actually found there was no meaningful correlation between people's income and the amount of meaning and purpose that they were receiving. And that this is absolutely not the case. We need actually meaning and purpose to become wealthy, because often it is what enables us to be our best selves and to show up in a way that truly adds value to the world and to our company. So as a first step, I just ask you, as you think about your own career, as you think about your organization, how do we let go of these myths so that they don't hold us back from actually realizing the sense of meaning that comes from every day? So what actually creates that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose in our lives and work? It comes down to 3 very simple things. We gain a sense of meaning from relationships, and I would argue this is the most important sense of meaning in our lives and work, is from relationships. The second one is from making an impact, but that doesn't mean you have to single-handedly solve for climate change, right? The actual definition of making an impact from a psychological standpoint is simply believing that the work you're doing matters to someone other than yourself. That's the bar for impact. That's what gives us a sense of meaning. If we end a day and we feel like the work I did actually helped at least one person, that gives us that sense of impact. And finally, it's growth. We need to constantly be growing as human beings to feel a sense of meaning. If we feel like we're stagnating, if we're stuck, if we're not sort of pushing through fear, we find that you're not able to actually experience that sense of meaning. And this is probably the most important statistic I want to share with you today, if you remember nothing else. When we surveyed people who are working full-time, so these are people working full-time, and asked them, are you fulfilled in life, right? Are you fulfilled in life? And then we asked them about being fulfilled at work. And we found of the people who are fulfilled in life, only 1% of them reported not being fulfilled at work. This is one of the greatest myths, I think, in our society as a whole, is this belief that work doesn't have to be a source of meaning. You can get that somewhere else. And what we're finding increasingly is that that's just not the case, because we're whole people, and we live whole lives, and we can't simply be fulfilled outside of work and be miserable at work. We're not able to process it. It is not how we actually operate. So the importance, the imperative, if you will, around this work is that when you're creating an environment, when you're not helping people be fulfilled at work, it actually is spilling over into their entire lives, back to their family, to their community. That this is actually about something much bigger. So how did we get here? I'm not a historian. I'm going to go through history very quickly in very broad strokes. If any of you are historians, I'm sure you'll have lots of asterisks of exceptions to what I'm saying. But I want to share with you, sort of at a high level, how did we end up here where work has become something that's so unfulfilling for so many people? How did we get here? If we start at the very beginning with the first people, that's supposed to be me as like a caveman or something, which sort of see the resemblance, but without glasses, it's hard to recognize. There was no such thing as a job, right? We didn't biologically have jobs. And there certainly wasn't such a thing as a manager or a company. These are all man-made concepts, right? So part of the answer is really looking back at where we were biologically from the very beginning. But as we started to move through history, we created an agrarian economy, right? It was the first sort of major economy. And it was all about creating value on the land and being able to create the ability to settle down, to start to create small towns, to create villages. And for the first time, we started to have the idea of a power structure between the landowner and the people who worked the land. So for the first time, we actually had this idea of management. And the basic value proposition between the landowner and the person working the land was, do your job or die. That was sort of the employee satisfaction metric, right? Because if you didn't do it, fundamentally, you're out on your butt. Many of the people early on were slaves or were in no power to be able to sort of care for themselves. So the earliest employee relationship started off with a very, I think, stark reality. We then moved into an industrial economy. And towards the end of the industrial economy, we started to see something happen that was really interesting. We started to see for the first time that employees started having more power. They started unionizing. They started creating labor stoppages where if you ran a factory, if you ran a company, employees could actually shut down your business. And you saw about 100 years ago the development of the employee satisfaction survey. And part of the reason we started measuring this was if employees are satisfied, they're not going to go on strike. It was a way of predicting whether or not you were going to have a labor shortage, which enabled you, therefore, to figure out what is that minimum you need to do to make sure that your factory, your organization is able to continue. In the information economy, we saw something fundamentally change, which is for the first time, knowledge workers, employees started to have more power than the employer, where we actually saw that the means for production in our economy was not so much just about land or about raw materials, but that people became the source of actual economic output of value. And for the first time, we saw that these employees had real power in their organizations because companies desperately needed to hire the very best people because the quality of the products and services depended on the quality of the people and keeping them highly productive. What we see now, as we're entering a new economic era, is the first time that truly employees have more power than employers. We have such an incredible labor shortage, especially for very specific skills, that we actually are seeing for the first time that companies are starting to look to their employees and ask a different question. Not, how can I get the most out of you? But actually, if I want to have the best people, what is it you actually need? Which is a very different question than the questions that were asked before. It became a question about what do we need as human beings? What do we need as employees? And trying to figure out how do we meet that need. In 2014, I wrote a book called The Purpose Economy. And it was based largely on my uncle's work as an economist at Stanford, where he had coined about 30 years earlier information economy and had proven we had moved from an industrial economy into an information economy. And what I was seeing in this change in work and the change in consumer behavior was that we were entering a new economic era where fundamentally our individual rights as consumers and as employees were shaping the way in which we were innovating. They were shaping the way in which we were leading. And they were changing the way in which we thought about the role of business in society. And I was thrilled to see just last month, in August, the Business Roundtable in the United States, they had 181 of the top CEOs in America basically come out together and say, you know what? Companies are not just about shareholder value. Because for the last 50 years, that has been the mantra. Companies' only job is to return value for shareholders. And we saw for the first time a fundamental shift where they said, business is about more than just shareholder value. They recognized that we are now in a purpose economy. And they said it's about shareholder value, that still matters. But it's also about customer value, employee fulfillment, employee well-being, ethical supply chains, so how we actually build and create what we do, and the overall well-being of the community in which we operate. This is a sea change in business, that these leading CEOs are now saying that it's not just about shareholder value, that we have to care about these other things. But the challenge is most companies have no clue how to do these things. Certainly around employee fulfillment, which is where I'm going to go into more depth. And we need to redesign how we approach work, how we approach companies, if we're going to actually realize the potential of this new model for business. We have, over the last 5 years, been working with companies, largely in the US, but some globally, really working on this question of how do we actually do this? How do we actually change the nature of a corporation? Because the systems we've built as companies were towards optimization for shareholder value and largely around maintaining power over our employees versus lifting them up. And this was an incredible opportunity to learn by experimenting, by doing research, to actually figure out how do we enable companies to thrive in this new purpose economy. One of the first things that we realized was that there's a big difference between employee fulfillment and employee engagement. How many of you are familiar with the term employee engagement? Handful. This was actually something that came out of the Gallup Corporation in Washington, D.C., about 30, 40 years ago with the rise of the information economy. And it's meant to measure discretionary effort. How much work is someone doing above and beyond what I'm paying them to do? It's a measure of how much you're getting out of your human resource versus your human being. And it measures many things that are actually very important, but it's a fundamental frame that dehumanizes work. Because it's all about output, and it's about management getting someone to be engaged. As human beings, when we're lying on our deathbed 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, whatever, however long it is until we die, we're not going to lie on our deathbed and say, oh my God, I had such an engaging life, right? This is not how we think as human beings. We're going to talk about a fulfilling life. Did we have great relationships? Did we leave the world a better place than we found it? And did we lean into fear or did we run from fear? These are the things that we think about as we're reflecting on our life. And they're the same things we should be thinking about as we reflect on the day-to-day of our work. As we're coming to the office, as we're leaving, these are the things that actually truly matter. A lot of people question whether or not people actually understand the difference between engagement and fulfillment. So we ask people, how would you, in your own words, describe the difference between engagement and fulfillment? And people are way smarter than we give them credit for because they completely nailed it. They do absolutely understand this difference. As you look at the engagement side, you see active, busy, right? Being engaged is about being busy. It's about being active. If I see an employee who looks engaged, it just means they're busy. If someone's sitting around not doing anything or appears not to be doing anything or is just talking to a colleague about their life, like that's not employee engagement. They're not busy doing the work. On the other end, you have fulfillment, which is about love, happy. These are emotions, about making a difference. So I often ask people, what do you see as a difference as you look at these two lists? And someone shared, I thought, a really profound insight, which was, one is about being a human being, and one is about being a human doing. Employee engagement frames work as fundamentally about just an action of doing, versus fulfillment, which has to do with our emotional, psychological state, which is actually much more important, we're finding, when it comes to productivity, when it comes to an effective, innovative workplace. We have seen in our research over and over again that this predicts success as well. Fulfillment's not just a question of it's nice to have for human beings, it's nice to have for people, but let's talk about real business here. We need to have results, right? When we looked at people who were fulfilled at work, much higher performers, they are much likely to stay in their job for much longer than people who weren't. And they also were much more likely to speak well of their company, to be ambassadors for your brand. So having fulfilled employees is not just a moral imperative, it actually is an economic imperative. So one of the most common things that people misunderstand about work, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is the idea that there's such thing as a purposeful job, a meaningful job. There's actually no such thing as a meaningful job. There's no such thing as a purposeful job. The actual act of making something meaningful has to do with our ability as human beings to create meaning around it. I have met people who have jobs where they're literally saving babies every day and their job is not meaningful to them. And I've met people doing work where you say there's no way in hell there's any meaning in this job, who report high levels of fulfillment in their work. And the difference is that they personally are taking ownership and creating that through the act of reflection. And one of the big problems with our culture of employee engagement is that reflection is not something that looks like you're being busy. We've actually created corporate cultures in which the actual space to be able to reflect on your work and to create that meaning is getting squeezed out of work. So even if you're doing work that's incredibly beneficial to the planet, incredibly beneficial to the community, if you're not helping people take that time to reflect, to create that meaning, that work is not fulfilling for them. And I think it's one of the most common mistakes of companies is just to have success equal busyness and to strip away that ability to truly create meaning. One of the things that is incredibly encouraging about this new model of employee fulfillment that we're seeing companies adopt is that unlike employee engagement, where when you ask people who's responsible for employee engagement, they say, my manager, leadership, the company is responsible for my engagement. When you ask people who's responsible for your fulfillment, the majority of employees say, I'm responsible for my own fulfillment. Think about how different that is. If you actually treated employees like adults who had responsibility for their own fulfillment, the whole equation changes. It's not something you do to them. It's actually more like, how do I help you develop the skills, develop the awareness, to develop the reflection, to realize your desire to make your work fulfilling, and your recognition that it's your responsibility. This is an incredible fundamental change in how we think about management when we actually assume employees understand that it's their responsibility to create meaning. The challenge is that while people understand that this is their responsibility fundamentally, what ends up happening is that we go back to our work, we're incredibly busy, and we are not actually acting on it. That we go sort of back to these old routines, that we sit and do our work, and we find ourselves sort of getting into this cycle of being unfulfilled, of not doing the things that we know are going to make us successful. The number one thing we found early on that was preventing people from actually acting on that understanding that it was their responsibility is that people don't know what fulfills them at work. How many of you would say you know what fulfills you at work? And how many of you would say that the majority of your employees know what fulfills them at work? This is one of the lowest hanging fruits, sorry to use the cliche, in our organizations, is to help people understand who they are. Because if you don't know what fulfills you, how do you actually do the reflection to create that meaning for yourself? Because you don't have a baseline to do it, right? You end up following someone else's purpose. You end up just sort of going with the flow of the organization. And even again, if the work should be meaningful, it's not because you lack self-awareness. And as you can see here, people who don't know what fulfills them are very unlikely to be fulfilled. And this is not just a responsibility of organizations to help people with this, but it also requires changing the way we think about education. No kid should ever graduate from school without this level of baseline self-awareness, because it is the foundation for success and well-being. What this does is what's in psychology called scaffolding. When we know what fulfills us, it creates categories in our mind so that as we're walking around town, as we're doing our jobs, we can quickly reflect and we have places to store our reflections. And it makes it much easier and much quicker to go about the process of meaning making. This is why, how many of you have taken an assessment, like a Myers-Briggs, Strength Finder, one of these workplace assessments? This is why when you first take them, it's usually this rush of meaning, because all of a sudden you have this scaffolding, and you're thinking about your work, and you're like, yeah, that's why I'm like that, and that's why I'm like that, and that's why I love doing that. And you start to see this sort of pulling together of sort of meaning in your life, and it's creating meaning. It literally is like a giant sort of tsunami of meaning for yourself, because it's connecting all those reflection points. The challenge, again, though, is that when people take these assessments, a week later, a month later, a year later, it's completely faded. How many of you had that experience? You've taken an assessment, it felt good, and then 6 months later, you're like, I think I remember doing that, but I don't even remember the results. Anyone had that? That's what happens, right? So it doesn't actually make a sustained impact just doing an assessment, because it starts to fade because we're not reinforcing it. So we went on this journey and spent millions of dollars figuring out how do we fix this problem. Because if we want to make work fulfilling, we need to figure out how do we actually help people build the right practices that make a difference. So we already learned assessments alone are not effective. We then spent a lot of money creating online content and articles to help people think about their purpose, to think about how they want to make their work better. It was sort of like a work self-help content that was delivered to people. Beautiful system, I loved it. Did not work. Same thing, people did not fundamentally shift their behavior, shift their mindset. Then we tried workshops. How many of you have workshops in your companies? A lot, right? Similar thing, people loved it. They often had great conversations. There was a lot of value. But again, 6 months, a year later, there was very little actual change in behavior. There was very little actual change in how people were approaching their work. So it again, while making some temporary impact, had very little impact on scalably changing the nature of work. Then we thought, managers. If we could only train managers on how to bring out fulfillment in their teams and to bring it out in themselves, that this would fundamentally be the scalable solution that would change work itself. Again, this failed because there was a lack of trust between managers and their teams, and there's a lack of time. Many managers have 10, 20, in healthcare you find often 30 or 40 people that report to them, and there was just not enough capacity to have a relationship with everyone on the team at the level needed to create this impact. So again, I went in the wrong order. That's going to fail too, in case you're wondering. Hate to give away the punchline there. So coaching was another model. We trained a bunch of executive coaches to do this work. And it was one of the more promising solutions where we saw that people would have these major aha moments. There was a lot of great reflection. There were sort of two core problems with it. One, it was expensive and tended to only be available to executives. It was not something you could scale down to every single employee in an organization. And then secondly, the relationship with a coach is an external relationship. So it didn't change the culture that embeds an individual. And therefore, once someone's out of that coaching relationship, there wasn't the reinforcement to help create that ongoing impact. And managers, we already know what's going to happen there. So what we learned through neuroscience, which is at the core of what this is about, is that traditionally our learning has been focused on what we call shallow learning, which is kind of like a computer where you write information in and you write information out. Did you memorize this? Do you know how to do this? It's all about a read-write of content, and that just goes into a certain part of our brain that does that kind of read-write process. And it's often a temporary-based knowledge. When you talk about deep learning, which is what we're all talking about today, now we're talking about more than just content. We're talking about emotion. We're talking about identity. And identity, your identity is a very scary thing to play with. It's something that brings up a lot of emotions for us, and we're trying to define who we are, what is our role in the world. So unless you're actually able to tie learning into someone's identity, it doesn't have that strong an impact. And it's behavioral. It actually has to change the way we move in the world. And this requires a different kind of learning than the kind of learning we traditionally have done in schools and traditionally offered in companies. It's much more different in that it's psychological first, and it's also, we found, social. The one thing we found that was absolutely transformational was a very simple idea, and the best ideas often are simple. We found that people who regularly reflect about work with their colleagues at work are way more likely to be fulfilled. That the act of what we call peer coaching, where people were not relying on their manager, they weren't relying on human resources, that they were organically just regularly talking to their colleagues about how their day was going, where they want to go in their career, helping to actually process work, that process of meaning, with their colleagues. And to me, this is one of the most amazing sort of insights because that resource already exists inside your organization, right? I talk about it as the Airbnb opportunity of our companies, right? Airbnb didn't go out and create new hotels, right? It didn't create a new search engine to find the best rate on a Hilton. It said, wait a sec, we can turn empty bedrooms in a city into inventory to help people who are wanting to stay in a given city. And what we're finding here is the opportunity is that 90% of your employees report that they're willing to act as coaches for their colleagues. 90% of your people. It's an incredible number of people. It's this incredible untapped resource inside your organizations that are able to actually bring this sense of fulfillment to people. And think about it. We said meaning and reflection is at the core of creating meaning. When you're able to actually have relationships where you can reflect, you're actually able to produce that. We talked about what are the sources of fulfillment and purpose. It's relationships, It creates space for that actual relationship with a human being, not just talking about when is that report due or why didn't you get this done, but it's actually a relationship that's built on trust and it goes deeper. It's about impact. People report that the act of helping someone, that coaching process, is an incredible uplift in oxytocin and in their sort of overall well-being. So it gives you a chance to actually make an impact on someone else's life. And it's obviously growth, because you're challenging yourself, you're reflecting, you're pushing yourself. So the simple act of supporting each other as colleagues, we believe is the catalytic opportunity in this new economy to fundamentally change the way which people experience work that enables them to take ownership of it. And we saw this in the data. We saw that people who organically engage in these kinds of conversation were significantly more likely to be fulfilled than those that don't. And think about this. There's so many things where you've gone out and spent millions of dollars on consultants, right? You spent millions of dollars on technology, but the answer really sits in your office already, in your organization already. It's how do you create the space and permission for people to actually talk to each other and not be seen that that activity is somehow not being engaged, not being productive. But it is actually perhaps the most important part of each person's day. The reason this is also so effective is that it actually changes someone's mindset. Because purpose is not about a destination, it's really about a mindset, a way of thinking about life and about work. And when we start regularly working with someone else, when we start regularly reflecting, it actually starts to change our wiring, our mindset about, as we show up at work that day, how we're processing and filtering what we're experiencing. How many of you have heard of growth mindset, the concept of growth mindset? I have. So growth mindset is this incredible innovation that happened about 15 years ago, I want to say. Dr. Carol Dweck found out this idea that people who see that it's not a question of I'm good at math or bad at math, but actually say, I can be good at anything that I work hard to do. It's a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, which is I am this way and I'm not that way. That we saw incredible outcomes in education when people were actually having this growth mindset. And this has now become incredibly prevalent in K through 12 education in the US, higher education, and most major companies now have growth mindset as part of what they're trying to develop in their employees. The challenge is growth mindset is aligned with the old world of business. Because there's a lot of human beings that are horrible jerks who have a growth mindset. The fact that you have a growth mindset does not in and of itself make you someone who's in alignment with your values, right? We need values, not just growth. Growth mindset's all just about yourself and your growth. But we need generosity. We have to realize we're not in this by ourselves, that actually we need to have other people supported by our work, making an impact. And it requires having a destination of some sort, because just growing for the sake of growing is not something that's healthy. And in fact, one of my favorite buildings is in Chicago. How many of you have been to Chicago? Handful. On Wacker Drive, which is the street around the river, there's a big corporation, old building, and the name of the company was General Growth. And I always thought that was like the most amazing name for a company. It's like, well, excuse me, what do you do? We grow generally, right? It's like, what do you do in your career? I grow, generally. Like, we need to have a purpose. We need to have some sense of destination, a reason, a why behind what we're doing. When you combine these things, we're talking about a concept that's going to redefine education and organizations, which is this purpose mindset, a belief that work is about more than a paycheck. It's about more than just ourselves, and that we come to work every day looking for opportunities for relationships, for impact, and for growth. And the people that we have found who have this mindset are significantly different than others. So think about your typical person, the transactional mindset, right? They say, my title, my job defines me. I am an accountant. I am a doctor. They say, I have no control over my career. They're a victim of their job. It's my manager, the organization. I have no sort of autonomy in my work. The only way to grow is to be promoted. How many of you have heard that? I want to grow, someone says, and like what they mean by it is they want a promotion, right? This is one of the most frustrating things for learning professionals is people just associate growth with going from manager to director to vice president. When we talk to people who have a purpose mindset, it's a fundamentally different way of looking at work. They say, I have control over my own career and well-being. They don't define themselves as much by their profession, and especially since professions are largely going away with changes in technology, but they find what brings them meaning is what defines who they are and how it helps them navigate their career. the constant sort of effort to look for better relationships, more impact, and more growth. And they believe that they can grow in any function. Some jobs, some organizations might be a better fit, but they don't feel like a victim of their job. This, more than anything else, we found was correlated with fulfillment. When people change mindset, we see a fundamental difference in how they show up. And just reflect on this yourself. Think about how you come to work each day, the mood you're in, how you're defining work, how you're thinking about work in your life, how much that influences how you see every single activity you do during the day. It fundamentally defines your entire day, regardless of what you're doing. So this is really, I think, the challenge of leaders, is to figure out how do we actually help people become aware of what fulfills them, help them build the social network inside an organization that is actually helping them become sort of fully aligned with their purpose, their fulfillment. And then finally, how do we actually create a culture in which a purpose mindset is the default assumption of what people you're hiring have and what people walking in the door every day have. Think about how different that is. Picture your organization with everyone being clear about what fulfills them, having the social support to help them on that journey, and fundamentally having this different attitude towards work. One of the things I do is I write a regular column for Fast Company magazine, where I interview leading CEOs about purpose and the role purpose plays in their work, and in how they've brought that to life in their company. And whether it's a consulting firm like PwC, or a manufacturer like Steelcase, or it's a company like Campbell's Soup, the CEOs who are driven by purpose, who are fundamentally successful this way, they have this mindset. And when they talk about their careers, they don't talk about it in terms of professional roles. They don't talk about it in terms of a fixed mindset. They actually talk about their journey as a constant quest to meet new and interesting people, to find ways to make a greater impact. They didn't want to get promoted to vice president because they just wanted the pay. They actually saw it as an opportunity to make a greater impact. And they're constantly looking to grow. I read somewhere the average CEO reads for, I think it's 5 hours a week, books and other forms of content. This constant sort of push for growth, that was the other part. These people had this mindset that was about constant growth. So they had this purpose mindset. And this is really what's going to separate effective leaders in this next era. So in closing, I want to share with you something I observed and a challenge to all of you. I began my career in Silicon Valley back in the 1990s. This is sort of when the dot-com, the internet bubble was first starting to emerge. And just about every major CEO saw that we were having a fundamental change in the economy. They said, the information economy is here. We have to be pretty dense to not see that. And they had one of two responses typically. On one hand, they said, the information economy is here. Let's go hire a consulting firm to build us a website, right? And on the other hand, they said the information economy is here. This changes every single aspect of our business. How we manage people, how we do marketing, how we build our products, that actually technology would change every aspect of their business. And the companies that are thriving today from then are obviously the ones who realized that the information economy was about a lot more than just having a website. We're at a similar moment right now. And as we saw with the Business Roundtable, CEOs around the world are recognizing that we're in a new economic era and that purpose is the key to success. And we're seeing two different responses to this question. On one hand, we have people saying, the purpose economy is here. We need to increase volunteerism and philanthropy. This is the equivalent of the website. And on the other hand, we have CEOs that say the purpose economy is here and it's going to change every single aspect of my business. It changes how I work with my people. It changes how I work with my customers. It changes how we show up in the community. This is not a one-dimensional change, but this is a fundamental restructuring of society that if I'm able to get in front of it, if I'm able to surf this change, I'm going to be part of this new era and understand new opportunity. And the people who are just saying, this economy's here, and I just need to do a little bit more work for causes, it's like holding up an umbrella with a tsunami. You're not gonna survive it. We need to fundamentally embrace this change, grab our surfboards, and realize the potential of a new world where human beings actually truly matter. And with that, I just want to thank you all for having me here, for the courage you have to go out there and every day fight to help people make their work more meaningful, make their lives more meaningful.